we have you in alphabetical order. I think Linda's in the middle. So you're in the throes of things right now, so I was telling you. I don't envy you guys right now.
It's hard. I mean,
Sure,
you know,
that's.
the budget stuff is
It's
one
not.
that I've been dealing with
Oh, yeah.
issues from way back for 4 years now, really. And it's got worse and worse and worse. But it's sad to me when things become so politicized, whether that's on the local level or at the national level.
Yeah. You're busy.
Yeah, it's busy, it's busy, busy. So you took the bar exam?
Well, I've been in Massachusetts in, let's see, I've been a Massler since beginning of fall 15,
Okay.
and then I've been a Rhode Island lawyer since beginning of fall 16. So now I'm both.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
I was both. I mean, yeah. When I graduated from law school, I took both the Mass and the Rhode Island law like back to back.
Mhm.
Right? So there was the multi-state and then the
Yeah.
individuals. Got that over with.
I'm probably waiting to DC, and then I'll probably call it, because now it's keeping up with CLE credits and
Right.
everything. You have to stay on top of it. You have the audience.
Yeah.
Copy of this.
Oh.
Back.
Good.
It's not very high res, putting flashbacks.
You know, you're trying to make a point about where the cost centers are or whatever,
Hmm.
they'll have this in front of them.
That's good, yeah. I have a,
It's not perfect. So.
first question for me.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Sounds like I should say, good morning, class. Thank you for joining us this morning. My name is John Marion from Common Cause. I know many of you, but not everybody. I want to thank you for coming out this morning. If this is your first event, this is our third event in this series. If it's your first, welcome. If it's your second or third, welcome back. This is finally, we got good weather. In February, it snowed. In April, it rained. And finally, in May, we have some nice weather. But so it's nice to have folks come out on a nice sunny May morning when you could be at the farmer's market or someplace else to learn about how our legislative process works. So you are the true citizens for being out here. I just want to start out with a couple of thank yous. I want to thank RISD. They provided us this wonderful space, if you haven't been in here before, for all three events. And it's Dean Cavici and Pam Kimmel, David Chandler, and Babette Alina, who's our government relations person, made this available to us for a very nominal cost, which is great for us. At Common Cause, I want to thank Colin Murphy's in the back, my board president, Vamala Pongsavan, who was at the table outside, Ellen O'Hara, Kevin Flynn is here, who helped arrange this. And then finally, I just want to thank our panelists, who I'll introduce in a second, for taking time out of their weekend to share their knowledge and insights about the budget process. As I said, this is the third in a series of programs we're calling, started this year, called Demystifying Democracy. And the idea was to spread out over the course of the legislative session some panels that explain how the legislative process works in Rhode Island and how you can get involved. So the first one in February was an overview of the whole legislative process. The second one in April was about how you can get involved and testify before the legislature. And this one in late May is about the budget process. And we decided to do this one last because the budget process is in full swing. So in the next several weeks, the House of Representatives will come out with its budget, and it will be law by the end of June, hopefully. So now is the time to start paying attention to the budget process. And now is the time people are paying attention to the budget process. So we thought it was appropriate to do this one in May. If you missed either of the first two, we put the video up online at our website at Common Cause Rhode Island. And next week we'll put this video online also, so you can follow that. So we're going to look at how the governor and the General Assembly put together and pass a budget each year. And we've created some handouts for you. One, you should have gotten at the table, is some basic numbers about the previous budgets and recent budgets. I don't know how, it's not super high resolution, and they turned the house lights down, so I'm not sure how well you're gonna be able to see this, but you can take that home. And we also created something for the whole series that is a set of documents about the legislative process in Rhode Island. So a glossary of terminology, because there's a lot of specific terminology, a sort of timeline of the legislative process, both throughout the year and during the day, a map of the building and where you can go if you want to see a hearing and that sort of thing, information about how to track legislation, and finally a checklist if you're going to go up there to testify. All of this, again, is available on our website. And if you know other groups who are looking to get people involved, please refer them to these. They're yours for the taking as PDFs to use and share. We are planning to do this series again in the future. So even though this is the last one for the spring, if you have ideas for future topics, we'd love to hear them. We're planning to run these same 3 topics again next year, but also add topics. So if you have future topics you're interested in or think we should be interested in, let us know. Finally, I need to thank a couple of other things. Besides RISD, we received some institutional support from the June Rockwell Levy Foundation, who helped make it possible. So now onto the program. I want to introduce briefly, and you have a summary, a biography of our 3 panelists, but I'll introduce them from my left. We have Brian Daniels. He serves currently as Executive Director of the Rhode Island League of Cities and Towns. And prior to that, he had several positions, including Director of Performance Management in the Office of Management and Budget for the state. Next, we have Linda Katz. Linda is the Policy Director and co-founder of the Economic Progress Institute, which was formerly known as the Poverty Institute. And prior to that, she had several positions, including working at the Rhode Island Health Center Association, so she's an expert on healthcare policy, as well as budget issues in Rhode Island. Finally, we have Dan Riley. He's an attorney. I don't know what firm you're at. Solo practice and private solo practice. And former state legislator from Middletown, served 2 non-consecutive terms, and is no longer at the legislature, but when he was there, was on the House Finance Committee, which you'll hear a lot about, which is the very powerful budget writing committee. We also invited and had scheduled State Representative Carlos Tabone. Unfortunately, he couldn't come. He is a Coast Guard reservist and had to serve his 2 weeks of reserve duty, and is in Virginia right now and apologizes for being unable to make it. So when we found that out on Thursday, we reached out to several other members of the Finance Committee, current members, and none were able to join us. So I don't want to spring this on you guys, but I forgot to mention, if you want to open and say anything, you're welcome to, or if you want to just dive into questions, we can. So everybody just want to dive into questions?
Yeah.
Okay. So the format that we've been doing for these, if you haven't been, is simply Q&A. So and this isn't to surprise our panelists, I gave them the questions in advance. We're here to help you understand the budget process, not to test their knowledge, and we won't be awarding a score. And then as time allows at the end, we'll take your questions, because I'm sure, especially with a topic like this, there'll be lots of questions. And we'll try to finish up promptly at 11:30. So I'll start with Brian with a real basic question, which is about how big is the state budget and where really are the cost centers? So what's driving the costs in the state budget?
It's a simple question, but I'm going to do a poor job demystifying the budget by saying that there are 2 answers to how big the budget is, and I'll explain that. This is a great summary, so if people have this, I could kind of use that as a starting point. When you talk about the state budget, the governor delivered the budget to the legislature for fiscal year 2018. That's the fiscal year starting July 1st of 2017. When she delivered the budget, it was a $9.2 billion budget request. So that's the number you see there in fiscal year 2018 recommended. At the bottom there, the total is $4.2 billion. That's called the all funds budget. That is the entire size of the budget. And as you can see on that table, there are different sources of funds that contribute to the budget. And the three that we talk about most frequently are general revenue. That's the one at the top. That's about $3.8 billion. That's about 41% of the total all funds budget. The general revenue budget is basically most of the taxes that most people consider the things that you think about as contributing to the budget. So that'll be personal income tax, which is about $1.3 billion. Sales tax is about just over $1 billion. And then you have business taxes, some departmental receipts, so beach fees, those go into the general fund, and the lottery. So those are the main parts that contribute to the general revenue budget. Then you have the federal funds budget, which is largely federal dollars that go to grant programs or other types of federal programs that are administered through state agencies. So Linda knows a lot about the Health and Human Services agencies. We get a lot of Medicaid dollars, we get child care dollars, WIC programs. A number of those programs are channeled through the state agencies, and those are federal dollars. Also a number of, I believe, transportation funds come in that category. And then the other big bucket of sources is other funds, and that's a pretty broad term, but other funds includes things like higher education tuition and fees. That's almost $1 billion. It's $900 million. Unemployment insurance, so the benefits that we pay into the unemployment insurance system, the temporary disability insurance system, that's about $350 million. That goes into the other funds category. Gas tax that we pay when we fuel up our cars, that's about $160 million. So that's the other funds component. So why did I say there were two numbers? Well, the all funds budget is the $9.2 billion budget. That's the all funds budget. But when we talk generally about the budget, we're usually using the general revenue budget. So that's the $3.792 billion budget. And the reason we talk about that is that's the one that the legislators and the governor have the most ability to affect through policy and through government organization. Most of the federal funds and the other funds are dedicated to particular types of programs. So the general revenue budget is where we actually do most of our work. So when you hear that there was just a report that we are facing a $130 million deficit, when you hear those deficit numbers, those are almost always on the general revenue. So the short answer is that the all funds budget is $9.2 billion, and the general revenue budget, which is the most common budget that we talk about, is about $3.8 billion.
Okay, so you used a term in there, and I'm going to ask Linda to explain it. You talked about the fiscal year, and that the budget we're currently looking at is for the fiscal year 2018, even though we're here in 2017. Linda, can you explain what the fiscal year is and then what Rhode Island's fiscal year is?
Right, so the fiscal year is the period of time that the budget covers, basically, and sorry. Better? Okay. The fiscal year is the period of time that the budget covers, and as Brian just said, when the governor submitted her budget in January, that was for the fiscal year that starts in July of 2017 and runs through the end of June of 2018. So when you hear fiscal year 17, which is what we're in now, in Rhode Island, the fiscal year starts July 1st and ends on June 30th of the subsequent year. When Brian talked about the federal funds that you see in the state's budget, actually the federal fiscal year, and it's taken me like years and years to try to balance this, and sometimes I have to write it out. The federal fiscal year, so the federal budget and the allocation of federal funds that we get in that federal line item pot, the federal fiscal year runs from October 1st through September 30th. So we are now in the 2017 federal fiscal year, which will end at the end of September, and the state fiscal year will end at the end of June for 2017. So every year in Rhode Island, there are about 3 months where the federal fiscal year budget funds are from a different fiscal year than the state fiscal year. So that can make it a little bit, sometimes the General Assembly will not want to act on something because they don't know what the federal funds are going to be coming in. And it can make it a little bit difficult to sort of assess how much we're going to be getting. Okay, so that's how the fiscal years work.
Okay, thank you. And it is confusing that they don't coincide perfectly.
Correct.
So Dan, we heard a little bit about the governor and about the General Assembly, the legislature. So who actually writes the budget? When we talk about as if there is a single budget, but is there a single budget? Who writes it?
Well, I'm going to have to repeat Brian when I say that there's really two answers to the question, because the budget itself, as presented by the governor in January or February, depending on the year, to the Assembly, is written by the governor's office through the Office of Management Budget, and it's primarily an agency-driven document. So, and I know Brian will be able to expound on this a lot more than I can because he was at OMB, so he did this full time. But you know, the budget process for the state is a year-long endeavor. Just because we're talking about it now and the legislature's dealing with it now does not mean that over across the street from the State House they're not working on next year's numbers and next year's agency requests, because that document is drafted by the agencies through OMB, presented to the governor. Obviously, the governor and the governor's office is going to be interacting with the agencies to make sure that their priorities are in that document. But when you think about it, a lot of spending in government is the result of programmatic decisions made by career bureaucrats. And I don't say that in an offensive way. I mean, they're there, that's what they do. So they're professionals. They know what they're going to need to spend on the actual nitty-gritty of state government for the vast majority of their programs. And there's really, at the end of the day, very little that becomes part of political or policy debates, at least at a higher end view, because there are a lot of things that either because of federal funds or agency requests that really slip in under the radar are not going to be the subject of debate. I always like to say, when you look at the RICAP, our capital fund for the state, you don't see legislators haggling over whether or not Slater Hospital needs a new HVAC system at the end of the day. They may have to cut something here and there, but not because they're particularly for or against Slater Hospital getting an HVAC system. But you have a guy at Buddha whose job is to make sure they replace the HVAC system. So he's putting that in the document. So that first budget writing process, that really is a year-long process, it is driven by the agencies, coordinated by the Office of Management and Budget, and at a very high level overseen by the governor's office. And their date, of course, is in January. They have to get that to the legislature. Now, that's when the budget request for the agencies becomes public, and it becomes a very political process at that point, because it has to be submitted to the House of Representatives. And constitutionally, the budget has to originate from the House of Representatives. And so it gets sent to the House Finance Committee for several months of hearings on every part of the budget. And the House Finance Committee is organized into several subcommittees so that we can hold hearings simultaneously on different agency requests, capital programs, and of course, new programs that are really going to be the focus of a lot of attention, and changes in law that are being proposed through the budget will get typically specific hearings. And so that process goes through the spring. And while that's going on, the legislative fiscal staff, driven by the House fiscal analysis staff, is simultaneously writing the budget. And again, this is the second part of the answer, because it's already been drafted by OMB, but the budget becomes a bill. And the budget bill is drafted by the legislative staff, and what they're doing is taking into account everything that they're hearing and seeing from the agencies, which is very important because of all of those seemingly mundane decisions that you really can't play around with as much. Feedback that they're getting based on the public hearing process, and of course, very importantly, the feedback they're getting from legislators, and in particular leadership. And so they're going to say, we want to change this, we want to put this in. Typically, it's a list of a few key items that House and Senate leadership are going to say, this has to be in there, or there's no way this is going to be in there. And so the legislative staff are going to be drafting a budget document that reflects all of those priorities. And that's a several months long process because, as you can imagine, it's not that there's a staffer on the third floor of the State House who writes something down and now it's permanently set in stone. It's the basis of a negotiation. And that negotiation goes through to the end of session, typically right before the end of session. And what comes out of that process is the legislatively proposed budget that gets submitted to the House Finance Committee for consideration, then gets sent to if it's passed out of the Finance Committee, which it most certainly will probably be passed out of the Finance Committee, gets sent to the floor of the House for voting a week later. If it passes the House, it gets sent over to the Senate, and they technically do the same process over again. But practically speaking, they've been engaged at a certain level, for a long time at this point. So that is how, I hope I just demystified the budget for you, and
We can all go
now it
now.
all makes sense.
Yeah,
Can I
Linda.
Maybe just following up with an example would help. So, for example, the governor put in her proposed budget that came out in January, reducing the car tax, right? Because Speaker Mattiello had emphasized that he wanted to reduce the car tax. Obviously, that costs some money, right? So the governor put in her budget proposal one methodology for reducing the car tax. The speaker's proposal is much more, would reduce the car tax much more quickly, and so would cost more money in the coming year. So what's happening right now, and if you read the paper, you'll see this, that the governor's proposal is in there for the car tax reduction. The speaker wants a faster car tax reduction, which would cost more money, and the governor's priority is also her college promise scholarship. So what's going on now is the political part and also the expenditure part of how much money, given that there's somewhat of a deficit, as Brian mentioned, how much can the state afford in terms of changing the car tax? And how much will the governor win anything around her college promise scholarship? So it becomes a numbers game, but it's also obviously a real political game.
So let's unpack the timeline just a little bit more, because I think one of the things I've learned, and I'm not a budget expert, so I'm going to learn as much as many members of the audience today. But one of the things I've learned over the years, and we've heard a little bit about it, it's a much longer process than I realized. So Brian, at what point, so for instance, all state agencies have to submit a budget to Office of Management and Budget. So it's actually government, the executive branch reporting to another part of the executive branch, what's the timeline from the very beginning?
Sure. The short answer is the budget process never really stops. It's an endless loop. It just keeps going. So as Representative Riley had mentioned, the legislature passes the budget normally at the end of session in June. And so that is the end of one fiscal year and the start of the next fiscal year. So right at the beginning, so let's say this coming July, it will be the start of fiscal year 18. OMB will be, Office of Management and Budget, will be working at that point immediately on the budget for fiscal year 19. And the way it kind of plays out is that once the final budget is passed and signed into law, then OMB and the governor's office will sit down and they'll say, based on our projected revenue growth, based on our expenditure growth, how much are we expecting to spend on education and human services and other forms of government, what do we think the fiscal outlook looks like for 2019? Unfortunately, in recent years, that has almost always been a deficit. So what happens in July is OMB and the governor's office take a look and say, What do we think that deficit needs to be? What do we estimate it to be? And what type of reductions do we need from our agencies in order to close that deficit? At the same time, as Linda had mentioned, there are proposals like car tax or the Rhode Island Promise Scholarship Program. So the governor may want to have additional tax reductions or new spending programs, so that has to get added into the amount that they're trying to, the target that they're trying to hit for the next fiscal year. So what ends up happening is the OMB gets a sense of what the deficit number should be, how much do we need to cut in the agencies, and we're just going to assume for the near future that we're going to be cutting because we have a structural deficit. What does that need to look like? So the agencies will go back, they have a target number, they will work internally and develop a proposal, a recommended budget to the executive branch, and that goes to OMB on October 1st. And that's required in law. It has to be done to October 1st. That budget request also has to go to House and Senate. So at that point, it's a public document. Anyone can take a look at it to find out what are the proposals that are being put forward by the agencies. The OMB and the governor's office and the agency leadership then spend the next 3 months really just talking through all the different scenarios, saying, what are the cuts that we can accept? Are there other things that you haven't thought of? And then they start to get a clearer picture of what the agency budgets look like. Also during that period, any special initiatives that the governor is working on, like car tax, those get fleshed out in sort of that September through December period. And then by the end of December, hopefully all the decisions are made and then you go into production mode, the governor's budget comes out. It's required to come out in law by the third Thursday of January. After an election year, there's a slight delay that gives the incoming governor, if there's a new governor, a few more weeks to work on that. And then it goes into the process that Representative Riley mentioned, where it goes into hearings. So if you know anyone at OMB, just be sympathetic to them around the holidays, because I worked in the governor's office for 2 years, in OMB for 5 years. You'd never get, basically from Thanksgiving, the day after Thanksgiving until after New Year's, you're just in the office the entire time, except for Christmas and New Year's Day. So if you know people, just be sympathetic to them during that time of year.
Invite them for meals.
Yeah, that's helpful. And then once it goes over to the legislature, obviously the House and the administration will have to go to committee hearings and respond to the questions that are being raised by the legislature, while also overseeing implementation of the current budget to make sure if there are any initiatives to cut spending or to roll out a new program, that those are actually done on time. So even though they may not be writing a budget, they are still watching the agencies to make sure that they're trying to stay on budget.
So there's roughly, this is gross generalization, a 6-month period where it's not a very public process from sort of July until January, where it's more it's happening inside the administration to prepare the governor's budget. And then in January, the governor usually gives an address to the legislature. It becomes sort of it's a public document before then, but then it becomes really sort of pushed out there, and the 6-month debate occurs during the legislative session, culminating in a June vote on the budget, and then it just repeats. So at what point, and this isn't part of but for people who are really interested in this, you mentioned, and I hadn't really thought about this, you can request that document in October. Right, so once these agencies all submit to OMB, that document's public, and you can request that. Do people request that? Like, do people look at this?
Some do, but largely a lot of them don't. And I think you may be in that case. When I worked in OMB, we would get some requests for that. There would be some media requests. There would be some advocacy groups that wanted to see it. The challenge is that the budget that comes forward in many cases is not what the agency puts forward is not necessarily what is going to be in the governor's final budget in January. So there will be some differences. But sometimes advocacy groups, and Linda could probably speak to it, will want to know what's on the table. What are we even talking about? So I don't know if you had experience on that.
Right. I have to admit that we haven't routinely requested those documents, but I.
I'm going to get in trouble for saying
No,
that.
no, no, you're not. Oh, it's Peter Reno, Lisa. It is important to look at those documents. So I'll give two examples. One is, so in the Medicaid world, for example, there's not that's the biggest part of, one of the biggest parts of the budget. It's like this year it's $3 billion, close to $3 billion. It's about a third of the overall budget, the all funds budget. Half of that money is half or more are from federal funds. But that's an area where every year, as the Medicaid agency is developing its budget, they're directed to come up with some ideas for cutting the Medicaid budget. There's not that many areas to cut sometimes. But a couple of years ago, for example, one of the areas was the governor wound up proposing in his budget to cut dental services for adults. And had we seen that proposal that the Medicaid agency would have put on paper that went to OMB to say we're going to cut dental services for adults, there could have been advocacy to try to convince the governor not to put that proposal, this was at that time in his budget. But we didn't see it until after the budget came out, and then there was a real concerted effort among advocates to say it's really foolhardy to cut eligibility, the coverage of dental services for adults, what happens to people in nursing homes, et cetera. Dental is part of overall physical health, and ultimately that proposal, which was designed to save some money, was defeated. And with the Medicaid budget, you always also have the argument of if the state spends $1, it gets a federal dollar. So if you stop spending some state funding, you're doubling, you're losing twice as much money for that service, right? Because you're losing the federal dollar if you don't spend the state dollar. On the other hand, there is opportunity, I think. A more positive example is we've been working with a number of people in the community to try to expand the state's earned income tax credit, which is a way of putting some money back into the pockets of low and moderate income working families. And for last year, the group met with the governor when she was proposing her budget, or 2 years ago, and requested that she include the earned income tax credit in her budget. So there is opportunity for people to get involved before the governor releases her budget to try to influence what is or is not in that budget. So I think we mostly think about, we have to go to the General Assembly and give input once the budget's released, but there's definitely opportunity to speak with the governor or her policy people before the budget is released to try to give some input on what's going to come out in the budget.
So Dan, and again, deviating from the script here a little bit, but so when you were on House Finance Committee, oftentimes there are these hearings or updates about the budget, and I noticed that there's the same kind of group of people in the audience, and Linda might be one of those people, right? Because she's interested. Who else is in the audience? What other groups? If people are interested in sort of what groups are following the budget, even from different ideological perspectives, besides Economic Progress Institute, who else generally follows the budget closely?
I was going to say League of Cities and Towns, because
Right.
I don't want Brian to have
Brian's
to fall off.
organization.
Care about parts of
That
the
is
budget.
the
That's a big deal.
expectation. Well, it's you have to think of it as who has the greatest stake in the budget. So there are a lot of different groups that have stakes in everything that happens, or a lot of things that happen throughout the legislative session. The budget's a unique document. It's its own bill. It obviously touches a lot of different people. So labor has a lot of interests, particularly Council 94 unions that are public sector unions. They want to see what agencies are proposing to do with regards to FTE caps for state employees, if there are any reductions. The contract process is kind of separate from the budget, but they're looking to see how much money
FTEs
is
are
full-time equivalent employees.
okay, so they're curious. The public interest unions are curious how many jobs are in the budget.
Sure, and it's a little different than, I think, watching your city or town council or school committee, because labor. Again, I don't mean to go off base here, but just so you know, labor contracts are negotiated separate from the budget, which is always interesting because the executive branch will agree with a bargaining unit to spend so much, and then they come back and say, okay, we have to spend this much, and the legislature says, well, what if we don't want to? And they say, oh, you got a contract we signed, so you have to. So those types of things aren't going to be hammered out, but they're looking to see pensions, healthcare, a lot of prior to 2012, 2011, now I'm dating myself, a lot of pension reform was handled through the budget process. So that's something that labor unions are going to be focused on. Any group that has a vested interest in spending coming out of the state, or how the agencies are trying to use the budget as a policy document, which it also is. They may not be getting any money, but there may be a group concerned or encouraged by an agency trying to use the budget to change rules or to have additional laws passed, which is another thing that happens. So they'll be in the room. But the people really in the room who are the real decision makers, the people you need to, if you were to be reading the faces of to figure and look over their shoulders to read the notes of, is the House Fiscal Advisor and the Senate Fiscal Advisor. They're the two people who, and then their staffs. And their staffs are enormously important, even though they may not be the advisor. They're actually in charge of different agency budget requests and are given extreme deference. They're the people to watch because they're the ones who are, the Speaker of the House is not going to the Finance Committee room in October to review spreadsheets, on a weekday. But the full-time agency or fiscal staff are. And they're going to go right from room 35, the House Finance hearing room, up to the third floor, and they're going to prepare a memo for the Speaker's eyes only, or they're going to call the Speaker and his staff, and they're going to say, this is what agency X wants, this is what the governor wants. If you think of the budget as a poker match, this is the governor showing her hand for the first time. And so, by law, the governor, his or her first time, the governor has to say what they want first, which is enormously important when you're involved in a political bargaining process. And so what they say after that hearing is going to be very important because they're the ones who are going to set the stage for the negotiations that are really going to determine what happens. And oftentimes, again, we talk about this $9 billion budget. The vast majority of the budget is not being negotiated by the Speaker and the governor or their direct staffs. A lot of the budget is assumed to be set in stone, but not necessarily by the governor and their staffs. The House and Senate fiscal staffs are given a lot of leeway in determining how the numbers play out and how the programs are put together. And so in October, they're the ones who are really, that hearing, those documents, that target date is for them more than anyone else.
So these staffs, these are essentially bureaucracies, small bureaucracies, experts, who one set reports to the House leadership, one set reports to the Senate leadership. And they have fiscal analysts and budget analysts. And so just so people know, there's a bureaucracy obviously within the executive branch, but there are smaller bureaucracies within both chambers of the assembly. And they're going to be important in a minute when we talk about the revenue estimating. But Dan, you mentioned the budget's a policy document, it's not just about how much is raised and how much is spent, but about decisions. Linda, can you explain that a little more and maybe some examples of sort of how policy decisions are made through the budget?
Well, expenditure decisions are policy decisions, number one. So for the Medicaid program, as I mentioned, if you're cutting benefits or rolling back eligibility for populations in the Medicaid program, that's an expenditure decision, which is also a policy decision. There are also some really non-even directly related expenditure decisions that are in the budget. So for example, this year in the budget, one article that the governor put in was to increase the minimum wage. That doesn't impact the state budget at all, right? That impacts what employers have to pay their employees. So there are bills by different legislators around minimum wage, but the governor, for political purposes, wanted to show that she supported increasing the minimum wage, so that's actually in her budget. there are also some changes to how government functions that are in the budget that are not expenditure related. But when Dan was talking about policy decisions in the budget, I forgot and should have thought of it. One of the a major change that happened in the budget was around the state's welfare program, the cash assistance program for families with needy kids, with young kids, and that program is really sort of a broad and sort of complicated program in terms of figuring out from a policy perspective what families do we want to help, how do we assist the parents to get access to work readiness services so that they can get off of being on cash assistance. And that program has always been dealt with in the budget process as opposed to in the Health and Human Services Committee or the Education and Welfare Committee to talk about really the policy for that program writ large, where the money is sort of secondary for that program. And that has always been of deep concern. I don't know that there are other programs like that where the policy, which is so important, gets dealt with just from the fiscal perspective.
Okay, that's interesting. I didn't know that. So some other basic issues. Dan, does the budget need to be balanced?
Yes.
So what? So air quotes aside, what tells us the budget needs to be balanced?
Well, so at a very basic level, and it does complicate negotiations, every dollar you want to take out of the budget, or every dollar you want to take out goes somewhere else, and vice versa. So if you want to add something in, you either have to take something away or figure out how to get something else in there. So as a practical matter, it has to be balanced because it's a budget. The constitutional requirement that I think you're alluding to is that every state except Vermont has to pass a balanced budget. And what that means is that if we're short of revenue this year, we cannot, unlike the federal government and Vermont, but Vermont doesn't do, they I think pass a balanced budget normally because their creditors would probably have something to say about it. We can't just simply borrow additional money, fill the gap. Well, we can borrow money, but what I'm getting at is we can't just like issue IOUs and structurally spend more than we're taking in. We have to pass a budget where our revenues equal our expenditures. So we have to figure out a way for both sides of the ledger to even up. Now, I use the air quotes because we pass a budget and it's capturing a snapshot in time. And as we've been talking about, and it's been in the news this week because of the revenue estimating conference, those numbers are constantly fluctuating. The revenue, our tax collections that's always fluctuating. We try our best to hit a consensus estimate, which I know we're going to talk about, how we arrive at that, but you're never perfect. And of course, agency spending is never perfect. There are things that happen throughout the course of the fiscal year, and if there's a major emergency and the folks at the Emergency Management Agency have to activate the Emergency Operations Center, they can't turn to their bookkeeper and say, hey, do we have the money to turn the lights on tonight, or do we just show up at 9 a.m. tomorrow? They're there, and they're going to have overspending in a category. Now, throughout the year, sometimes you can make up for it. You can hold off on the paperclip purchase until July 2nd or July 1st so that you don't impact this year's budget, but practically that's not how you can fix a lot of things. So we have a requirement to pass a balanced budget, and we have to keep the budget in balance as best possible, but it's a moving process, and so that's why you close out fiscal years with operating deficits or operating surpluses, which then get rolled into the next fiscal year, and we move, and then sometimes you have to pass a supplemental budget if things are really bad.
So in a nutshell, unlike the federal government, we can't long-term strategically engage in deficit spending.
Correct.
And build up an ongoing deficit. So,
I want to jump in on that too, just because I worked on Capitol Hill, I worked for Congressman Langevin in DC, and one of the things that the difference coming from federal to state, because the state budget has to be balanced, there is exactly that trade-off that Representative Riley had mentioned, and the policy debates that Linda had mentioned really matter. So it's easy in the federal government to say, we're going to do tax cuts, or we're going to do new spending, and we're not going to pay for them because we can issue debt. You don't have that luxury at the state level. So exactly as Representative Riley said, every dollar that comes, if you want to do a tax cut, that has to be a dollar matched in an expenditure reduction. And that makes the policy conversations even more important at the state level, because you have to have that trade-off. You don't have the luxury of issuing debt, and that's a huge difference.
Dan mentioned a supplemental budget. I hadn't even thought about talking about this, but what is this? And I've only seen a couple of them. I've been doing it 9 years. They're not. They're pretty rare in Rhode Island. I think they're more common in other states for a number of reasons. But what's this? Anybody want to take a shot at what a supplemental budget is?
Were you there for, trying to think,
I
I don't think either
wasn't
of us
for
were
the
there
big
for
one.
it.
Yeah,
The last one.
the challenge with the supplemental budget is usually when we do a supplemental budget, when the governor submits, for example, the governor submitted her fiscal year 18 budget at the same time she submitted the fiscal year 17 supplemental. So there is a supplemental budget that comes out every year, but it's usually pretty small. It's exactly those cases that Representative Riley had mentioned. If there's a little bit of overspending in one place, can you try to move things around in the current fiscal year? Or if you get new federal money, you can start, you would reflect that in the supplemental. The challenge with the supplemental is that usually it's passed at the same time as the budget in June at the end of the fiscal year. So by that time, it's kind of too late anyway. It's pretty rare, and I think maybe during the recession, there had been an earlier supplemental when there was, I'm not exactly sure of that, but that's where, when there's a huge drop in revenue, that's when the supplemental matters, when you're so far off of your targets on revenue or spending that the supplemental becomes a very serious conversation. But usually it's just moving money around and trying to stay within the budgeted amount.
I've managed to mystify the budget process even further, and I apologize. I guess the key takeaway would be, we have to account for every dollar. So if we said we're spending X, we're bringing in Y last year, when we close out that year, we can't just say, oh, we got that right, we got that wrong, because we have to account for we're closing out an accounting year. So we, as a practical matter, we do pass a supplemental that basically rolls everything into the next budget. So we know if we have bills pending, they still have to be paid, and if we have extra money sitting around, that's going to be spent. If we didn't pass that supplemental, we would incur liabilities or have assets that we wouldn't be able to do anything with. The big issue, I think that's really, and you were a veteran of the real supplementals. When the economy crashed, we had to pass an entirely separate budget outside of the rest of the budget process just to make up for the drop off in revenue.
And so it's a bill that passes during the current fiscal year to make adjustments to the budget that's already in place because something dramatic is
Yeah, I mean, if you
typically
think
happening.
of your own household budget, if you were to, which I always try to do and I've never done in my life, right? Create an annual budget, and it would be based on, say, there's 2 adults in the home. Here's what we expect each of us to be earning over the coming year, and here's our expenses over the coming year, and we want to try to come out to zero at the end without using our credit card, right, to build up. We're not going to charge things, right, because the state can't charge things like that. And then halfway through the year, one person loses their job and the income drops precipitously, then you'd have to make an adjustment, right, during that year. That's what happened with the recession, and making an adjustment during that fiscal year for the state, whereas in normal times, you know, you make some guesstimates at the beginning of the year about what your income's going to be, what your expenditures are going to be, and things change over time during the year, and by the end of the year you could look back and say, well, we thought we were going to spend, you know, that the income was going to be $50,000 combined, but one of us had overtime or one of us got sick and couldn't work, and so at the end of the year we really have $48,000 instead of $50,000, so now we're going to figure out how to make that up, and then we're going to do a new budget for the coming year to figure out, again, sort of making guesstimates about how much income's going to come and how much our expenditures are going to be. Just sort of like the revenue estimating.
Yeah, so it's perfect time to pivot. So you've heard this term, revenue estimating conference. It's actually the perfect time to talk about this because one just concluded last week, and it was in the headlines a little bit that there's $100 or so million hole in expected revenue for next year. So and we'll start with Linda, but we'll have other people jump in. What is the revenue estimating conference? How many are there? How do they work?
Too many? No. So I think it's also useful to talk about the caseload estimating conference too, because they happen together. So in November and May of each year, the fiscal staff from the House and the Senate and from the governor's office get together, and they hear, on the revenue side, they hear, for the revenue estimating conference, they hear testimony from expert economists who help them decide how much do we think is going to come into the state in revenue for, well, say for November, they're looking at the revenue for the next fiscal year. Let's see, let me back up. The November revenue and caseload estimating conference that was held in November of 2016 gave the information that the governor needed to use in creating her budget for fiscal year 2018, right? So the budget that she was creating, that she released in January of 2017. So experts come in, they give testimony before the staffs of the House, the Senate, and the governor's budget office. And then those three entities talk among themselves, and this is all public and people can go to it, to, if you want to watch paint dry, they decide, well, what do we think? How much are we going to, what are the taxes going to be? What are the corporate taxes going to be? What do we think our our economic picture is going to look like for the state in the coming year? And those revenue numbers are what the governor needs to use in crafting her budget. Similarly, they look at caseloads for mostly for the Medicaid program, which again, about a third of the state budget is the Medicaid program. And they look at how many people do they think will be served through the Medicaid program. How much money will be going to the hospitals? How much money will be, it's looking at the people and what the expenditures they think are going to be in the Medicaid program. And the governor needs to be using those numbers as a base in crafting her budget, again, for the coming fiscal year. They also look at the numbers that would be served through the cash assistance programs for families and for adults with disabilities. Those are fairly small numbers. So the Medicaid sort of the big kahuna. So those numbers in November, the governor needs to use in developing her budget for the coming fiscal year. And then in May, the one that was just held, those same people get together. They hear again from the state agencies on what the expenditures have been on the Medicaid side and on the cash assistance programs. And they also hear from the experts about what's been happening this year in terms of the revenues and what's going to be happening in the coming year in terms of expectations of revenues that will be coming in for the state. So that hole that you've read about in the paper on the revenue side mostly comes from collections on corporate taxes being down, but also sort of not as rosy expectations about income tax that's going to be coming in. And that seems to be across all states. The projections about revenues coming in are not as rosy as they have been over the past couple of years.
And then there was some spending, so people have heard about UHIP, which is this computer system that's trying to unify all.
Yep.
And they had anticipated that the rollout of that computer system would save the state money, and ultimately it's not saving as much money.
Well, to talk about this briefly, because you
Yep,
you didn't provide
Pandora's
vodka.
box.
So the UHIP issue has sort of two impacts. One is that what was expected was that people would would be able to apply for and renew their benefits through an online system, and therefore the state could have fewer FTEs, fewer staff at the Department of Human Services, because people would be accessing benefits on their own. As an aside, we knew that wasn't true, and we tried to raise that that shouldn't be put into place. But there was an expectation that the state would save some money on personnel because people would be accessing benefits on their own. That did not come to fruition, and you may have seen that the state wound up hiring back people after they laid off 70 folks because they realized they needed some more people to help both fix the system as well as help people access benefits. So that savings wasn't realized again, that impacted Medicaid hugely because that's the biggest part of the human services expenditures. The second thing for UHIP was that the state also expected because UHIP happened, the state was not able to implement the processes that help keep eligibility current. So there are some people who have been receiving mostly Medicaid who were probably not eligible for it, and in the previous, before UHIP happened, the state would have rolled those people off more quickly. So there's people staying on longer than had been anticipated when they did that caseload estimating back in last November, right? The idea was UHIP was going to create all of these savings. So the Medicaid caseload is up. I have to say that the Medicaid caseload might have been up even higher because there are a lot of people who never got on Medicaid since UHIP happened because the system isn't working to get people on. So bottom line, the Medicaid caseload is a mess. The child care caseload is a mess. It was very hard at this caseload estimating conference in May for the three bodies, the three experts, right, House, Senate, fiscal folks, and governor's folks, to get accurate information from the state agency about, we're supposed to predict how many people are going to be on Medicaid and child care in the coming year and how much we're overrunning in this year to get those numbers straight. Luckily, ending on this on a good note, happily, there are now people who are working hard to get some accurate information in the UHIP system and also to fix the system. So the presentations that were made by the staff for DHS in terms of trying to explain those numbers, and from the Medicaid office, they're working hard to try to get accurate numbers. It's just been bad for a number of months.
So these estimating conferences, I find them fascinating because I think we're all used to a public hearing. The public comes in and testifies before a school board or a legislative committee or something, but this is something different, right? It's a bunch of experts testifying basically to each other. And then at the end, do they take a vote, or how do they have to come up with a number? This is how much money and how many people in the caseload case, but do they take a vote like a committee would?
Usually it's by a consensus. They normally come to a consensus on each of the revenue sources. So personal income tax, they'll say this is what we think the number is going to be. Business taxes, sales tax, and they go through every revenue source, and also on the caseload expenditure side, what they think those numbers are going to be. It sounds like a completely ridiculous process, and you're probably thinking, why do they do that? The reason they do that is that the alternative is much worse. And what happens is, in other places, when you don't do that, and you don't have a number that the governor and the General Assembly agree on, then it's very easy for the governor or the legislators to pass a budget and say, we are going to institute this new program, or we're going to cut taxes, and there's going to be this amazing stimulus effect, and we're going to get more tax revenue out of it, or we're going to become more efficient and it'll reduce our costs. And so they're basically balancing their budget based on hopes and dreams versus the revenue estimating conference, which says you actually have to hold to these numbers. And the only way you can change those numbers from the governor's perspective or the legislature's perspective is to make policy changes that would say we are going to remove the number of people who are eligible for a particular program, or we're going to scale back benefits so that we have fewer people accessing those benefits. You can't just hope that there's going to be, it's sometimes called dynamic scoring, where we have, we'll have a tax cut, it'll be a huge stimulus effect, and all this tax money is going to come in, and they put it in the budget and they bank on it when it may not happen.
So, yeah, so they're fascinating events. I've only peeked in at them because it's not really what Common Cause works on. Because they're not like your typical legislative committee. They're more of a discussion, and the sides are trying to convince each other of their positions, and they do come to a consensus. They don't necessarily take a vote, but rather they come out with a series of numbers. Linda?
Yeah, I think it is an important process, and it's interesting, when I met on the caseload side, there are some legislators who think that caseloads for other human services programs, particularly services for people with developmental disabilities and people with serious and persistent mental illness, should be part of the caseload process as well, because it is a way to try to get some sense of how many people are going to be eligible for these services that are funded with state and federal dollars, and trying to get that big picture. On the other hand, sometimes you sit there and you watch the consensus is, well, I guess we should say as part of the process, coming back for the caseload, after hearing from the state agencies, then the House, the Senate, and the governor's office come into the next process, which is the paint drying process, I would say, so let's say the Department of Human Services said, we think that there will be 21,000 people getting cash assistance in the coming year. And the House will come in and say, well, we think it's 21,003. And the Senate will say, well, we think it's going to be 21,007. And the governor's is sticking with maybe not even sticking with the state agency, could come in with a different number. So sometimes the differences in terms of the numbers of people and the related expenditures seem to be pretty small. It's kind of interesting to hear what the reasons are behind why they came up with different numbers, and in fact, understanding the reasons would be more helpful, because we don't really hear that background of why do you think the caseload's going to be here and you think it's going to be here, or the same with the revenues. So learning more about that, like what those assumptions are, I think would be helpful from a public policy perspective, instead of just seeing the people sitting there and saying, okay, well, you said 21, you said 21.5, you said 21.7, let's agree on 21.5 because that's in the middle, and which is sometimes what happens. I mean, it's not necessarily, oh yeah, based on this policy distinction, we're making this decision. Sometimes it's just, okay, well, we gave you those, we'll give you give us these, in terms of the numbers.
So, so it's publicly observable, but not all of the deliberations are
Yeah,
like,
which would be helpful.
Yeah.
I think, to hear more of that background stuff.
So that just happened, and now they often say that's sort of the starting gun for the sprint to the end of the legislative session. So I'm going to ask Dan to kind of explain what's going to happen in the next month or so. So when does the House come out with its budget from the committee? How soon does it get voted on the floor, onto the Senate and onto the governor, and so forth?
So the reason they say this revenue estimating conference is the kickoff to budget season is because budget season, I make it sound like, this is the NFL and it's that exciting. Is because by law, the final budget that gets passed has to use the figures arrived at in the caseload and revenue estimating conference in May. So that November conference is used because the governor by law has to use those numbers for the proposed budget, but you don't have the whole spring to just use those. You have to use the new consensus figure, and that is what you arrive at. And so you can imagine that could throw the process into a bit of a tailspin, because you've spent now months in this process, negotiating, agreeing on things, disagreeing on others, somewhat arriving at what you want the budget to be between legislative leadership, individual legislators, interest groups, and the governor's office. And now you have numbers coming in that could potentially, and as we saw last week, are not good. And now are forcing all of those assumptions that had been made to be revised downward. And so now what happens is, technically the budget could be introduced any day, but it won't be introduced for probably, if it's June, probably a few weeks. It depends on the year too. This is a non-election year, so the budget will probably be introduced later rather than earlier because there isn't a push to get out as quickly. But that's an aside. What happens now is the legislative staff are going to be cramming, and they're going to be conferring with the governor's office, but now this is really a legislative process. This is the legislature's in the front seat, and they're going to be taking all of the hearings, all of the data, negotiations are going to be, in full swing to arrive at a document that can be presented to the House Finance Committee for a vote. Now, keep in mind, there's one thing, there's the 600-pound gorilla in the room, and that is that there is a constitutional requirement that a budget, or it's actually, they don't use the word budget, it's any appropriation for a private appropriation or any money going to a city or town has to require at least 2/3 of the legislative body to pass. What all of that means is that because the budget includes appropriations to the cities and towns, all of the money that Brian secured for the cities and towns, it now triggers a requirement that it has to pass the House of Representatives with at least 50 votes. So that's not a clear majority, right? And so what that means is that unlike virtually every other piece of legislation that passes the House of Representatives or the Senate, you can't count on a simple bare majority. You need more than that. And that gives rank and file legislators a little bit more leverage than they ordinarily would have. I'm a Republican. I still didn't have a lot of leverage, but we got a little closer on the budget because they needed more votes. And so the added wrinkle in all of this is that as the budget is being drafted, individual legislators are going to leadership and saying, I really need to see this in the budget. Or what normally happens is, I've had this bill pending. It's been held for further study. I need to get it out of committee. And, I really need this bill. It could be relatively inconsequential. It could be important for them in their district, or it could be a really big bill that got a lot of attention. And they're going to go to leadership and say, I really need this bill. And what leadership is saying is, great, unless I can move this bill or figure out how to placate them, they may not be with me on the budget. Obviously, that's a negotiation. It can go both ways. If you want to go to the speaker and say, I'm not voting for your budget unless you give me this, you better be ready to act on that, or be ready to go to Siberia if it fails. I was always in Siberia, so I said, come on over. It's not that bad over here. You get a lot of flexibility, but you don't pass anything. But so as you can imagine, that's being thrown into it. And I say that because the budget could come out any day. But the budget is now in play with all of these other pieces of legislation that have nothing to do with the budget, but they're votes for the budget. And so the reason the budget almost always gets passed right before the end of session, and right before that, that late night session that always happens at the end, is because all of those bills kind of have to come out together. Ordinarily, you're not going to accept I'll vote for the budget if you give me that bill. The speaker says I'll give you that bill, or a chairman says I'll give you that bill, and now you wait. You typically want those things to happen in close proximity. But remember, there's also the Senate. And so every time you have that negotiation on the House, you have to be making sure there's a corresponding effort on the Senate. And so all of these negotiations that have nothing to do with the budget process itself now have everything to do with when the budget gets passed. So when we say the budget could be passed 3 weeks from now or 4 weeks from now, it's not because the revenue estimating conference was that much of a disaster and now it's just we can't get the thing to add up. They'll get it to add up pretty quickly. It may not be pretty, it probably won't, but in terms of actually drafting and figuring out what to put in, that's going to be wrapped up relatively quickly. Now the real political process, the negotiations start. And what that means is that it could happen anytime. before the end of the fiscal year. It could happen after the end of the fiscal year, which I know is another question. I don't know if you wanted me to segue into that from there as a part of this.
Sure, but before that,
Yeah.
so the House Finance Committee will see the budget publicly,
Mhm.
and then how quickly does it vote on the budget, and then how quickly does the whole House vote on the budget after that?
So now, mind you, the House Finance Committee has been hearing the budget since the budget was introduced. Typically, as soon as session starts in January, all of the committees will start meeting fairly quickly as legislation gets introduced. The Finance Committee is held back a bit because the Speaker knows that we're going to be getting the budget and then we're not going to see the light of day for several months. So you get a pretty easy January and February on the Finance Committee. As soon as the budget gets rolled out, you start doing agency hearings and individual budget article hearings, and it becomes this process. So by the time we arrive at now, you're relatively familiar with everything that's going on. If you're a member of the Finance Committee, you've been copied on everything that's happening in the Revenue Estimating Conference. You've been copied, and you typically don't go to it, but you can. But because the fiscal advisor who's sitting in and is a part of that conference is also your fiscal advisor as a member of the House, you're being copied on everything that's going on. So you are aware of where things are heading. You're aware of any agencies that are having problems. So when you get to this time, there really aren't any surprises. What happens now, as I said, you're really going to be drafting that final document, and the Finance Committee isn't going to be doing a lot as a committee until that one hearing when you are told to show up at 4 and you're there for 8.5 hours and just sitting around doing nothing because invariably it's the end, the final negotiations are happening, and then you get presented the budget and it's literally too hot to touch. And again, that's because of all those negotiations. That's the practical effect of that. So we were told to report, we're going to pass out the budget, and we're waiting. By the time it actually gets printed, it may be 10 or 11 at night. We get it. It's now in front of us, and you have to pass out each budget article. I said that once before. Let me just explain briefly what an article is, because you'll see this in the news. All a budget article is any time the budget requires a change in law. So the budget is a series of articles. The actual collection of money and spending of money in general is one article, because we have to pass a bill to do that. And then anything else that requires a change in law, if you're renaming a government department, if you are authorizing a department to do something that they otherwise didn't do, that is a separate change in law and will be organized into different budget articles. And that's true through the entire process. That really, you'll see hearings will be delineated based on articles and things like that. At this particular hearing, when the House Finance Committee is voting out the budget, you have to vote out each article one by one. Some years, I think, I don't know what the most articles I had, maybe 35 or 40. Sometimes they can get it down to about 20. And that's a motion, that's a debate, typically not that much of a debate, and then a vote at the committee level. Theoretically, all of the articles will be passed by the Finance Committee and recommended for passage, and so they will be submitted to the full House for a vote. Unlike every other piece of legislation, the budget has to, what we call, sit on the desk. And so it gets sent up, transmitted to the clerk for passage. If any bill, and this happens to every bill, it could go up that day. It could go up, if we suspend the rules normally, the next legislative day. It's on the calendar for passage for the House. The budget requires to be sitting on the desk for, and this is going to be embarrassing, 7 days?
7 days.
Seven. I never really counted because
okay.
I was going to be there 7 days from there, so it was just what was on the calendar. So it lays on the desk for 7 days. And that's important because unlike other pieces of legislation that can somewhat appear out of nowhere and be changed out of nowhere and quickly get passed before anyone is any wiser, the budget does have to sit out there for a while for it to be seen publicly. The media will scrutinize it and legislators can see it. And that's important because now legislators can offer amendments and they have time to have amendments drafted. That being said, the chances of an amendment getting passed are not slim to none, but they are not very good. I say that because sometimes you do catch something and you draft an amendment, and practically speaking, everything that gets drafted in the State House, there are no secrets. Do not draft something you don't want to be seen by people, by the lawyers at the State House, because every person's going to have a set of eyes on it. And invariably, you'll get a phone call saying, you know, I see that you've drafted this amendment, and you're expecting to get chewed out over it or told, you know, it's never going to see the light of day. And then they say, yeah, you have a point. So can you just agree that we'll have the finance chair sponsor that on budget night at the very beginning so we can get it over with? And you'll say, oh, sure, yeah, you take the quiet victory and you go home. Because beyond that, the amendment process is usually used for purely political reasons to, you know, make a point, to either create tough votes for people or to otherwise encourage a debate on the floor and drag out the night, which can be, you know, it can have an effect if you're trying to achieve it at the end of the night when it's 2 in the morning. And hot. It's not air conditioned. You know, a friendly legislator you agree with on the amendment, you see getting ready to hit their button to get up, and you just reach over and say, you know what, enough. I think it was a great idea, but I'm exhausted and I want to go home. And just please don't introduce it. And you know, you can try to move on. That happens too. And then you get to budget night, which is that. I don't mean to take so much time.
No, it's okay. So this whole sort of, you know, there's a week-long process starting. It comes out of House Finance, groups, the media, legislators scrutinize it. Legislators, I think it's maybe 24 or 48 hours in advance, have to draft amendments. And sometimes you'll see in the media, you know, 70 amendments have been drafted. And some of them are for bluff, right? Some of them are to sort of have a rank and file legislator tell the leadership, this is what I care about. And then budget night comes, it's got a lot of hoopla, all the reporters show up, like you don't realize the Rhode Island press corps is so big, because suddenly there's 15 reporters there. People up in the gallery where I sit, people bring cases of water and are sort of digging in for the night. And there sometimes all those amendments will be introduced, sometimes just a few will be introduced. Depends on sort of what points people want to make. And you mentioned tough votes, so oftentimes legislators will introduce something. So for instance, the Republicans have often introduced things to strip the funding to repay the 38 studios bonds out of the budget, to make a point about 38 studios. And so that when you run for re-election, you can say, I wanted to defund the 38 studios bonds or something like that. And then it goes, and I'm just kind of summarizing for purposes of time because I want to take some questions. Then the House typically passes it. They pass each article by simple majority, and then the overall budget by the supermajority. Then it goes to the Senate. The Senate, some have described it more as a rubber stamp. They typically pass it very quickly, much less debate, and then it gets sent to the governor. Do governors ever veto budgets? Anybody been around long enough to remember a governor vetoing a budget?
Governor Kucheri vetoed at least 2 budgets.
Yeah, so governors have vetoed budgets. They have to veto the whole thing because we don't have a line item veto. And then if the governor vetoes the budget, the legislature has to come back in. It's not like a normal bill where you can choose to override it or not. The legislature has to come back in and do something.
The only distinction, I mean, it's the same veto power the governor would have over any piece of legislation. The only difference is that because of the requirement that the budget be voted on and approved by a supermajority or 2/3 majority of the House and the Senate, means that it is de facto veto proof. So you're going to have to get a legislator to change their vote on an override vote in order for the governor's veto to not be overridden. So the practical effect of vetoing a budget is really for the governor to show their disagreement and to force the legislators back in June on a hot day. And you can do that with timing. But beyond that, you're just getting them angry.
So one other little point I'd like to draw out, a couple of years ago, I think the budget passed after July 1st. And it was a lesson to me that the government didn't shut down. So when that happens at the federal level, we hear about government shutdowns and there's this brinksmanship occurring. Anybody want to dive in on why
You can't shut down Rhode Island government. It's shutdown proof. It's baseline shut down, so that you can't do it anymore. The reason is that constitutionally, if we do not pass a budget by the beginning of the next fiscal year, all that happens is the appropriation bill that was passed for the previous fiscal year remains in effect. So, I mean, it starts off a new date. It's not that, you have to find additional money in that budget, but that budget essentially gets passed by itself again until you pass a new budget. So if we don't pass a budget until July 4th, we're going to have 3 days of spending at the prior fiscal year's levels. But nothing will close, bills will still get paid, tax rates will still stay the same way.
So we've only got about 5 minutes. I was going to get into a little bit about how cities and towns deal with this process, because this all flows down to how much cities and towns get out of the state budget. But I would like to see if anybody has any questions. I can't really. So if you could just say your question, I'll repeat it for the recording, and then.
I'm wondering how much the governor's policy proposal, so for instance, the deals that the Commerce Corporation is making with companies coming in and getting tax write-offs, how much can she claim that as revenue coming in when she's putting together her budget?
Okay, so the question is about governor's policy proposals, specifically these tax deals that are occurring from Commerce Corporation to recruit companies into the state, and then sort of how does that translate into the budget?
Can she claim that as additional revenue?
Can she claim that as additional revenue? Does anybody want to tackle that one?
Because, as Brian said, we don't have dynamic scoring like in Congress, so you can't cut a tax and then budget for growth and use that in the same fiscal year. So the governor's economic development proposals actually have the opposite effect. All of that is treated as spending in the budget, and it's a program. So it's a pretty sizable program, and it's booked on the Commerce Corporation line items. So you actually have to account for that elsewhere in the budget.
Can I just say
Yep.
quickly on that? Because one of the issues is, those are tax expenditures, right? Those are monies that are not being collected, and that's what's accounted for in the budget. There's about $2 billion in tax expenditures like that, where it's money that the state is not collecting, sometimes for reasons that we would, that are simple, like getting a write-off for taxes that you pay in other states. But the tax expenditures for economic development purposes, like this, are ones that really require some more accountability in terms of whether, when we're foregoing those revenues, are we realizing money down the road that we would then see in corporate taxes or increased sales taxes or increased income taxes from folks. So as we're talking about the budget process, we're talking about the money that we see in the budget that the governor puts out there every year, but understanding the revenue that we're not collecting, what we at EPI call the hidden budget, is as important as well. And there are reports that come out every 2 years that show those dollars.
Yes, sir.
I have a question about bonds.
Okay.
What are the powers of the state in terms of being able to issue bonds? And when do they have to go to the voters and get approval? And when can they independently go out on their own, go out on their own? And I'm thinking now of the fact that our governor's a baseball fan, and there's talk of a new stadium that could be built, which would be supported partially by new bonds. So
Yeah.
when do they have to go to the voters for approval, and when can they?
Okay. So I'll try to summarize that we're recording this for the microphone. So the questions about bonds, when do they have to go for public approval? When don't they have to go for public approval? And that was actually on my list of things we didn't get to, so that's a great question. Anybody want to tackle the difference between the kinds of bonds?
So generally speaking, we have, the state will issue general obligation debt, and you'll see that almost every election cycle. There'll be some amount, typically broken down by proposition for different projects. And so that's voter-approved general obligations of the state of Rhode Island, backed solely by the full faith and credit of the state. And those are typically used for capital projects. The other bonds that we issue, conduit debt is what it's typically, well, let me rephrase, it's not all conduit debt, but it's debt issued by quasi-public agencies. And Rhode Island's a little, I don't want to say unique, but it's different from many states where they just, the end run around the voters is you create an authority or a corporation to just go out and issue bonds to do whatever really the legislature and the governor want to do, but you don't want to wait for the next cycle or it's politically unpopular, we don't do that. In Rhode Island, we have these authorities and corporations that can issue that debt, but with a few narrow exceptions, all of that debt has to be approved by the legislature before that entity can then borrow that. And that's under the Kushner Act. So if you ever hear the term Kushner debt thrown around, it's an act of the legislature. It's actually typically put in the budget for practical purposes that says the airport corporation can go borrow $50 million to do a project. That won't, if we approve it, that won't, or they, not me anymore, approve it, that doesn't mean the voters will not, have a say on that at that point. The authority, the airport corporation, will be able to borrow that money backed by revenue. So all of that debt is not technically being paid for back through tax dollars. It's being paid for through individual revenue streams, but it still has to seek legislative approval. And there are a few narrow exceptions to that for agencies like the Narragansett Bay Commission, because they're considered a regulated utility, that when they issue debt, they actually can do that without approval of the legislature, because the idea is that they're already facing scrutiny based on their finances. So all of their debt has to be backed by ratepayers and that sort of thing. So that's the other exception to that.
There's a fascinating history, if you ever want to read about the emergence of quasi-publics. Robert Caro, the biographer,
Power Broker, great book.
the power broker, about how Robert Moses invented using quasi-publics to issue debt in New York in a largely unaccountable way. Why don't we do one more question? Yes, ma'am.
I don't understand the role of the Senate. You talked a lot about the House in this whole process. Does the Senate have any role at all?
Yeah, so the question is about the role of the Senate, which I think we've minimized a little bit here. And we don't have anybody here to defend the Senate. I should have invited a senator. Does anybody want to take a crack at the role of the Senate?
I think Representative Riley mentioned that the Senate it's largely behind the scenes. The votes need to get through the Senate, so a lot of the negotiations during that period after the conference, the revenue estimating conference in May, the House and the Senate, and sometimes the governor's office, are having those conversations to make sure that they have the votes in the House and the Senate. So even though it's not necessarily as much of a public role, it does go through, they're usually part of the process, because it has to go through the Senate as well. And one of the reasons I think that you see a difference here is that, as Representative Riley had mentioned, the budget has to originate in the House. That has traditionally been a House responsibility. In contrast, the Senate, its area has normally been the advice and consent component. So even though they don't focus as much on the budget side, their power comes largely at approving who are the directors of the departments and other administration officials. So they get to put their stamp on the administration that way by going through the hearing process, the approval process for department directors. So that's how they have another way of influencing that process, but not as much directly through the appropriations process.
So I'm a native New Yorker, and in New York, this final negotiation is called 3 men in a room. And it's literally the governor, the majority leader of the Senate, and the Speaker of the House. And they will come out of a room, and they'll do it, all the reporters will be assembled outside the room, and they'll announce the deal they've cut. And lately, they've gotten to the point where, like sports teams, they've branded it. They put up a background, and they name the budget for the year, and they do this sort of unveiling of what these three wise people have done. In Rhode Island, it's nice. We have a little more gender balance. So now it's 1 woman and 2 men in a room. At one point, it was 2 women and a man. But there's this negotiation that occurs outside the public eye, and the Senate is a big part of that. From our perspective at Common Cause, one of the esoteric issues we're very interested in is how judges are selected. And the Senate has approval over judges, but the governor gets to pick them. And we often think that part of that negotiation, even though it has nothing to do with the budget, is the Senate sort of imposing its, saying to the governor, hey, we want this person to be a judge. And some governors have acceded to that, which is why you see a lot of former senators on the bench. And so there's this negotiation that the Senate's definitely a part of. So I'm going to stop there because we're at 11:30, unless there's anything anybody's dying to say. Unfortunately, one of my questions was going to be how to improve this process. I assume some of the panelists are willing to hang around for a few minutes if people have additional questions. But I want to thank them for being here this morning. I want to thank you all. Again, I want to urge you, we're going to try to do this again. We might try to tackle some different topics in the fall and then repeat this next year. These 3 topics we did this year, repeat them again next year. So we're going to send you an email with sort of an evaluation and allow you to give some input. So please fill that out if you get that. We also have some material out at the desk, if you didn't get it, about sort of the Common Cause agenda. We work on voting rights and other things, and it's a crucial time for some of those bills. So if you want to see some of that information, we can provide it for you out there. And just encourage you to become involved with Common Cause more generally. So thank you again for coming, and I'm very appreciative, and have a great Saturday. Thanks. Covered a lot of ground in an hour and a half. You think about it, you're like, that was great. So, yeah. I didn't think Kushner. I hadn't heard that.
I'm glad you took that one. So like, I know it sort of well.
I stayed away. I was coming straight down the middle on that one. Oh, yeah.
A question for the NBA. I was curious about this. This is a detail. Sure. Just curious. So I'm looking at that. Yeah. So I was just using 5%. That would be about $3 million. I was very trying to get on with that.